the death of the dollar. What BRICS and digital currencies will do to your purchasing power. Your money is dying, not tomorrow, not next year, but right now, while you sleep, while you scroll, while you convince yourself that the same dollar bill in your wallet holds the same power it did when your parents were young. I'm going to tell you something that will make you question every financial decision you've ever made, and here's the terrifying part. The people who control the global economy have already made their move. And most of us didn't even notice. They're not asking for your permission. They're not waiting for you to catch up. They're building a new world where the dollar, the currency that has dominated every corner of this planet for nearly 80 years, might become nothing more than a relic, a memory, a cautionary tale told to future generations about what happens when empires grow too confident. The signs are everywhere, written in headlines you probably skipped, buried in economic reports you'll never read, whispered in closed-door meetings between nations that used to bow to American economic might. But here's what keeps me up at night. This isn't just about geopolitics or economic theory. This is about your savings, your salary, your ability to put food on your table and keep a roof over your head. And the clock is ticking faster than anyone wants to admit. Let me take you back to 1944, to a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. World War II is still raging, but the Allies know they're going to win, and the question isn't if but what comes after. Representatives from 44 countries gather in a hotel, and in those rooms, over the course of 3 weeks, they redesign the entire global financial system. They create the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and they make one decision that will echo through the next 8 decades. They tie every major currency to the US dollar, and they tie the dollar to gold. America, with its untouched industrial base and massive gold reserves, becomes the anchor of the world economy. Every country that wants to trade internationally needs dollars. Every central bank starts stockpiling them. The dollar becomes more than money. It becomes power itself, the ability to reward allies and punish enemies, to fund wars and broker peace, to build empires and topple governments. And for most of your life, this system has been invisible, like air or gravity, something so fundamental you never questioned it. But empires built on inevitability have a fatal flaw. They forget that nothing is actually inevitable. Here's where you need to pay attention, and if you're finding this valuable, hit that like button right now, because what I'm about to explain will fundamentally change how you see money. The dollar's dominance rests on 3 pillars. It's the world's reserve currency, it's the primary currency for international trade, especially oil, and it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, which sounds impressive until you realize that full faith and credit is just another way of saying, we promise. For decades, this worked beautifully. Countries needed dollars to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, to trade with their neighbors, to protect themselves from currency crises. The US could print money, and the whole world would absorb the inflation. It was the greatest economic privilege in human history, an exorbitant privilege, as France's finance minister once called it. But privilege breeds complacency, and complacency breeds vulnerability. The US started using the dollar as a weapon, freezing accounts, imposing sanctions, cutting countries off from the SWIFT banking system. And every time they did that, they sent a message to the rest of the world. Your money is only yours until we decide it isn't. Now picture this. You're the leader of a major economy, maybe Brazil, maybe Russia, maybe China. You've watched the US freeze billions of dollars in Russian assets overnight. You've seen how quickly financial access can disappear, how sanctions can cripple your economy without a single shot fired. You felt the sting of inflation imported from American monetary policy, watching your currency weaken every time the Federal Reserve makes a decision thousands of miles away without consulting you. And you start thinking, why are we playing this game? Why are we letting one country, one currency, one set of politicians control our economic destiny? This isn't paranoia. This is rational self-interest. And this is exactly what's happening right now, across multiple continents, in coordination that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago. They're calling it de-dollarization, but that clinical term doesn't capture the revolutionary nature of what's unfolding. This is Financial Independence Day for half the planet, and the implications are staggering. Let's talk about BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Originally just an acronym coined by a Goldman Sachs economist to describe emerging markets, it's evolved into something far more significant, a coordinated alliance representing roughly 40% of the world's population and a quarter of global GDP. These aren't small players. These aren't countries you can ignore. And they've spent the last several years systematically building an alternative to the dollar-dominated system, piece by piece, agreement by agreement. With a patience that Western observers consistently underestimate, they're establishing bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. China and Russia now settle their trade in yuan and rubles. India buys Russian oil in rupees. Brazil and China trade directly in their own currencies. Each agreement seems small in isolation, barely worth a headline, but together they represent a pattern, a deliberate architecture being constructed while the Western world argues about other things. And here's what should terrify you, or at least make you deeply uncomfortable. They're accelerating. In 2023, BRICS expanded, inviting 6 new members including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Egypt. Think about that for a moment. Saudi Arabia, the country whose 1974 agreement with the US created the petrodollar system, the foundation of dollar dominance in energy markets, is now hedging its bets. They're accepting yuan for oil sales. They're in discussions about a BRICS currency. The petrol yuan isn't some distant theoretical possibility anymore. It's happening in real transactions, in real markets, right now. Every barrel of oil sold in yuan instead of dollars is a crack in the foundation. Every trade agreement that excludes the dollar is another brick removed from the wall. The structure still stands, but for how much longer? And what happens when enough bricks are gone? But wait, because it gets more complex and more interesting. Enter digital currencies, and suddenly we're not just talking about which paper currency dominates, we're talking about whether paper currency has a future at all. China has already launched the digital yuan, the ECNY, the world's first major central bank digital currency. And they're not testing it in some lab. They've processed transactions worth hundreds of billions of dollars. They're integrating it into everyday life, into apps that hundreds of millions of people use daily. And here's the strategic brilliance. A digital yuan can bypass the entire Western banking system. No SWIFT network to be cut off from. No correspondent banks that might comply with US sanctions. Direct, instantaneous, government-to-government or person-to-person transactions anywhere in the world. The implications for financial sovereignty are profound, and the United States is scrambling to catch up, debating a digital dollar while China already has a working system deployed at scale. Now I need you to understand something crucial, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now because most channels won't connect these dots for you. Digital currencies aren't just faster versions of what we already have. They fundamentally change the nature of money and power. Traditional currencies require a banking infrastructure that the West, particularly the US, has dominated for generations. Digital currencies, especially central bank digital currencies, can operate on entirely different rails, new systems that don't touch New York or London. They can be programmed with conditions, tracked with precision, controlled with granularity that cash never allowed. Some people see this as dystopian surveillance. Others see it as efficiency and transparency. But everyone should see it as a shift in who controls the levers of economic power. When China can offer developing nations easy integration into a digital yuan system, when they can provide the technology and infrastructure for countries to join an alternative financial network, they're not just offering currency, they're offering escape from American economic hegemony. Let me paint you a scenario that keeps financial analysts awake at night. It's 2027, maybe 2028. The BRICS nations have launched a common digital currency, backed partially by gold, partially by a basket of commodities, partially by the economic output of member nations. It's not trying to replace domestic currencies, it's designed purely for international trade, a bridge currency that none of them control individually, but all of them benefit from collectively. Simultaneously, more countries join the system. Indonesia, Mexico, Nigeria, countries tired of dollar volatility and political weaponization. The network effect kicks in. The more countries use it, the more useful it becomes, the more countries want to join. Oil trades increasingly happen outside the dollar. Major commodity exchanges begin offering prices in this new unit. Your dollars can still buy things, but they buy less because demand for dollars drops. The US can't export inflation as easily anymore. The Fed's decisions matter less globally. American power, built on economic dominance, starts to recede, not with a bang, but with a gradual, irreversible erosion. You're probably thinking, this sounds theoretical. Something that might happen eventually, but not something that affects me today. And that's exactly the mistake people made about every major economic shift in history. They didn't see the 2008 financial crisis coming until it demolished their home values and retirement accounts. They didn't anticipate how quickly COVID would disrupt global supply chains. They certainly didn't predict that a currency created as a joke, Dogecoin, would briefly have a market cap larger than Ford Motor Company. The future arrives faster than we expect, and it arrives unevenly. Right now, in certain parts of the world, de-dollarization isn't coming. It's already here. Russian tourists use Chinese payment systems. African nations increasingly trade with China in yuan. Middle Eastern countries diversify their reserves away from dollar-heavy portfolios. Each individual action seems manageable, but trends compound. And when enough individual actions align in the same direction, you get a tipping point. A moment where the old system doesn't collapse exactly. It just becomes progressively less relevant until one day everyone realizes the world has moved on. Here's what nobody wants to tell you. Your purchasing power is always a function of collective belief. The dollar has value because people believe it has value, because they'll accept it in exchange for goods and services, because they trust that tomorrow it will still be worth roughly what it's worth today. But belief is fragile. It's sustained by habit, by infrastructure, by convenience, by lack of alternatives. Remove any of those supports, and belief starts to crack. This is why central banks obsess over confidence. This is why inflation expectations matter as much as actual inflation. Once people start doubting, once they start looking for alternatives, the psychology shifts. We saw this with cryptocurrencies, how quickly billions of dollars flowed into digital assets that didn't exist a decade ago, simply because enough people started believing they were valuable. Now imagine that same psychological shift happening, not with speculative assets, but with the fundamental medium of international trade. Imagine countries, not just individuals, deciding they believe in something else more than they believe in the dollar. The United States isn't sitting idle, of course. The Federal Reserve is researching a digital dollar. The Treasury Department watches de-dollarization trends. Policymakers understand the stakes. But here's the challenge. Defending dollar dominance requires restraint in using financial sanctions. And geopolitical reality keeps demanding exactly those sanctions. It requires fiscal discipline to maintain confidence in the currency, but political pressure pushes toward deficit spending. It requires maintaining technological leadership in financial infrastructure. But that requires investment and coordination that moves slower than Chinese central planning. The US is trying to preserve a system while operating under constraints that make preservation increasingly difficult. Every sanction package proves to other countries why they need alternatives. Every debt ceiling crisis raises questions about American fiscal stability. Every delay in digital currency development cedes ground to competitors. The US still has enormous advantages: the deepest capital markets, the most liquid financial systems, the strongest military to back up economic power. But advantages erode when you're fighting inertia and momentum moving in the opposite direction. Let's get personal for a moment. What does this mean for your money, the cash in your bank account, your retirement savings, your salary? If the dollar loses reserve currency status, even partially, the immediate effect is imported inflation. The things you buy that come from other countries, electronics, clothing, cars, food, become more expensive because your currency buys less. The government can't finance deficits as cheaply because foreign buyers of treasury bonds decrease, which means either higher taxes or reduced services or both. Your savings lose value not through dramatic collapse but through steady erosion, the kind of slow-motion crisis that doesn't make dramatic headlines but quietly devastates household wealth over years. And if you think you're protected because you don't follow economics or politics, because you just work and save and hope for the best, understand that those are the people who get hurt most in currency transitions. The wealthy diversify internationally. They hold assets that adjust to inflation. They have advisors who see these shifts coming. Regular people wake up one day and discover their life savings by half of what they used to, and nobody can explain exactly when it happened or how to reverse it. But there's another scenario, one less discussed because it's more complex and doesn't fit into simple narratives of American decline or BRICS ascension. Maybe we're not heading toward dollar death. Maybe we're heading toward a multipolar currency world, where the dollar remains important but not dominant, where regional currencies handle regional trade, where digital and traditional systems coexist, where no single country can weaponize money the way the US has for the last 80 years. In this scenario, your purchasing power depends more on your own country's economic management, less on decisions made in Washington. Trade becomes more complex, but potentially more stable, because it's not dependent on one country's political whims. Developing nations get more autonomy, but they also lose the stability that dollar dominance provided. It's messy, inefficient in some ways, but maybe more resilient because it's distributed. The question isn't whether this is better or worse. The question is whether you're prepared for it, whether your financial strategy accounts for a world that doesn't look like the one your parents knew. Here's where doubt should creep in, where you should question everything I'm telling you and everything you hear from anyone about economics. Nobody knows how this plays out. Experts predicted the euro would fail, and it's still here. Analysts said cryptocurrencies were bubbles, and Bitcoin keeps recovering. Economists thought China's growth would slow dramatically, and they keep exceeding expectations. The future is radically uncertain, and anyone who claims to know exactly what's coming is either lying or deluded. What we can do is identify trends, understand incentives, recognize when systems are under stress. The trend toward de-dollarization is real and measurable. The incentive for countries to seek alternatives to dollar dependence is rational and strong. The stress on the current system is visible in everything from sanctions proliferation to debt levels to geopolitical fragmentation. But trends reverse. Incentives change. Systems are more resilient than critics expect. Maybe BRICS fractures over internal disagreements between China and India. Maybe a crisis demonstrates why dollar liquidity still matters. Maybe American innovation in digital currency and financial technology reasserts dominance in a new form. What terrifies me, honestly, is not any specific outcome, but the widespread lack of awareness that we're at a potential inflection point. Most people in Western countries have lived their entire lives in a dollar-dominated world and cannot imagine anything else. They assume tomorrow looks like yesterday. They plan retirements based on assumptions that may not hold. They make career decisions and investment choices using mental models built for a world that might be ending. And when change comes, it will seem sudden even though the signs were visible for years. This is how these transitions work. Slowly, then all at once. The Soviet Union looked permanent until it wasn't. The gold standard seemed eternal until Nixon ended it. The assumption that housing prices always go up held until 2008. We're terrible at recognizing paradigm shifts while they're happening. We see individual events, not patterns. We focus on daily news, not structural transformations. And by the time the shift is obvious to everyone, it's too late to position yourself advantageously. You're just reacting, trying to minimize damage instead of capturing opportunity. So what should you do? I'm not a financial advisor, and this isn't financial advice, but I'll tell you what I think about. Diversification becomes more important in a multipolar currency world. Holding some assets in different currencies, in different countries, in different forms, makes sense when you're uncertain which system will dominate. Physical assets, real estate, commodities, have value independent of any particular currency regime. Skills and education that work across borders matter more when currency fluctuations can destroy wealth. Understanding how money actually works, what gives it value, how systems change, this knowledge becomes more valuable than ever because the rules are being rewritten. Most importantly, stay informed but skeptical. Question narratives from all sides. The people telling you the dollar is doomed might have an agenda. The people insisting nothing will change might be in denial. The truth is probably messy, complicated, and uncomfortable for everyone's preferred worldview. Read multiple perspectives. Learn basic economics, understand that money is ultimately a social construct, a collective agreement that can be renegotiated. Let me bring this full circle to where we started, to that uncomfortable feeling that your money might not mean what you think it means. The death of the dollar, if it happens, won't be dramatic. No one will wake up to find their dollars worthless. Instead, it will be gradual, a slow shift in what dollars can buy, which countries accept them eagerly, and which prefer alternatives, how much power they confer on holders. It's already happening in small ways that most people don't notice. The percentage of global reserves held in dollars has declined from over 70% to under 60% in 2 decades. Alternative payment systems are growing. Digital currencies are moving from theory to practice. The world is reorganizing financially, and the United States is no longer the unquestioned architect. This isn't necessarily catastrophic. Empires rise and fall. Currency regimes change. Life continues. The British pound lost reserve status, and Britain still exists. The question is whether we see it coming, whether we adapt, whether we make this transition a managed evolution rather than a crisis. What keeps me coming back to this topic is the emotional weight of it, the way it connects to deeper questions about power, fairness, the future we're building. There's something almost poetic about watching an empire's financial dominance erode, about smaller nations asserting independence, about technology enabling possibilities that weren't feasible before. But there's also something unsettling about instability, about entering unknown territory, about the potential for conflict when old powers don't want to relinquish control and new powers are impatient to claim it. Money is, power is politics is war by other means. When you change how money works, you change everything downstream from it. You change who can afford to project military force, who can invest in innovation, which political systems thrive and which struggle. The BRICS nations aren't just trying to create a new currency. They're trying to create a new world order where Western dominance is no longer assumed. And whether you see that as liberation or destabilization probably depends on where you sit and what you value, but either way, it's happening. So here we are, at the end of this journey through the death of the dollar, or its transformation, or its resilience, depending on how the next decade unfolds. Your purchasing power is always at stake in these transitions. The money you earn, save, and spend exists within systems much larger than yourself. Systems that are changing in real time, whether you're paying attention or not. What I want you to take away from this is not fear exactly, but awareness, a recognition that the financial world your parents knew is not the one you'll retire in, that assumptions must be questioned, that preparation matters, that understanding these forces gives you agency in a situation where most people will feel helpless. If this resonated with you, if it made you think differently about money and power, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button. Click the like. But most importantly, leave a comment. Tell me if you think I'm right or if I'm completely wrong. Tell me if you're worried or if you think this is overblown. Tell me how you're preparing or why you think preparation is pointless, even if you disagree with everything I said. Especially if you disagree, share your perspective because these conversations matter. We're navigating unprecedented territory, and we figure out the truth together, through discussion, through challenging each other's assumptions, through refusing to accept simple answers to complicated questions. Your voice matters in this, so speak up. And I'll see you in the next one, where we'll keep pulling these threads, keep questioning everything, keep trying to understand the world that's coming whether we're ready for it or not.